everybody. Welcome to episode number 18 of the Calamasa Insider Podcast. I'm Will Kolbow, City Manager for the City of Calamasa. And the last 4 episodes of the podcast, I think, are probably some of the most important podcasts that we've released on this show. I've actually created a playlist on our YouTube page, the Calamasa Insider YouTube page. So if you go to YouTube, just search for Calamasa Insider, and you can subscribe to us on YouTube. But I did put those in a playlist on YouTube. But you can also just go back and listen to those last 4 episodes. So if you're new to the podcast, I really encourage you to listen to episodes 14 through 17. I really encourage you to listen to all of the previous episodes, because I think that there's a lot of important information. All of this is about educating the public and getting a little bit more insight as to what we do and how we do it and why some of the things happen. Again, this podcast, I've said it before, I've said it many times, this is about the why. And in the particular with the 4-part episode, Calamasa isn't necessarily facing the financial challenges that other cities are facing right now, especially maybe our neighbors like Yucaipa. But there's always risk that we could, based on what was discussed in those episodes. And so I think that it's important that we be aware of those facts and understand those realities when decisions come up for decision making. So I think that's why that's important to know. And the city will be faced with some important decisions coming up here in the next few months. And I think that, and we have an election coming up as well. So I think it's important for the public to fully understand not only the city and what we do on a day-to-day basis, a year-to-year basis, but also to understand the environment in which we operate in and that we're subject to. And sometimes, decisions aren't, there's more to decisions than meets the eye. And what this podcast is attempting to do is kind of expose some of what those things are so that you have proper context when you hear certain items come up for discussion and approval at the city council level, at the planning commission level, things like that. So I think those things are important. But again, if you did miss it, all of our July episodes 14 through 17, very must listen items, I think. Over the last, I'm actually back in the office after being gone for about 10 days. And I returned to the office on Tuesday. And yes, believe it or not, city managers do need to have some time off once in a while. I hope people are okay with that. And the family and I, or at least minus my daughter, took a road trip all the way to Boston, Massachusetts. I had shared a few weeks back, about a month and a half ago maybe, that my daughter left for Boston to participate in a ballet intensive. And now my wife and my daughter are in New York City. So my wife and our 2 boys, we took a road trip to Boston to pick her up and take both of them to New York City. I ended up driving about 3,600 miles, including side trips. So we made a trip down to Arches National Park off of Interstate 70. We took a trip down to Wichita to visit some friends of ours. Another thing that we do when we're out on the road is we try to visit state capitals. And I think we're up to maybe 20 or so, 2021 or something like that. We try to actually look at the state capitals and the state capitol buildings. So in this trip, we visited Denver, Topeka, Jefferson City, Indianapolis, Columbus, and Albany. And so those were, you see some interesting buildings, and it's interesting the take that each of those cities take, or each of those states take on their state capitals. But another thing, and I do want to talk about a couple of public policy things and some things that I've noticed in my travels that could apply here. Obviously, roundabouts has been a contentious issue in this community, and it is amazing to me that roundabouts are widely used in other states. I noticed in particular in Colorado and Kansas, a lot of interchanges have roundabouts at them. I was actually surprised by that. I was surprised by how many roundabouts there were in those 2 states in particular. And they were mostly at interchanges. So when you think about that in our local area, we think of Cabazon, right? We're right by Casino Morongo. There's roundabouts there. that actually have multiple legs to them. It's not just a 4-way stop type of thing that they were replacing. There's other roads that come into them as well. So they're a little more complex. And those were complex as well. They had similar issues, but even with regular, just, the on and off ramps and then the street that they were meeting. And I don't think I stopped, maybe once I stopped at an intersection with a roundabout. Other than that, the traffic was moving. And I do recall in New York, Syracuse, New York also, there was a pretty large roundabout that had a really large median, really large center. And that one seemed to run really efficiently as well. I think that when people know and understand how to use roundabouts, they actually work very well. That was just my observation. So take it for what it's worth. And of course, being in Boston and then in New York, once we got to Boston, we actually dropped off our rental car and we used public transportation the rest of the time that we were there. And it was really efficient. Obviously, it's a little bit different being in other cities. It's amazing when you go to other bigger cities, not as big as Los Angeles necessarily. Obviously, New York's bigger than LA, but in LA or in other cities like Denver, and Denver actually is spread out pretty well. But you go to other bigger cities like Columbus, Indianapolis, things like that. The suburbs aren't very big. Like, you really kind of sneak up. You just kind of drive, and it looks like there's a lot of open space, and all of a sudden you're in the city. And then once you leave the city, it's gone pretty quickly as well. So it doesn't extend that far outside of their downtowns. Their downtowns are more concentrated, and obviously that's the way it is in New York. But then you still have Queens and Brooklyn and those areas of New York City. But obviously, if I lived in New York City, there would be no reason for me to own a car. It would cost way too much because obviously you have to pay for the car payments or buying the car outright. But then you have to pay to park it, and parking in New York City is very, very expensive because real estate is very, very expensive. So, and public transportation is everywhere. It's available everywhere. It runs at all hours of the day. You can get to where you need to go. We flew out of LaGuardia, so we caught a subway, which took us to a bus in Queens that took us right up to our terminal. Very, very easy when my sons and I came home this past Monday. So, again, in California, especially Southern California in particular, the idea of public transportation may not be an effective solution given how spread out we are. I think that you'd have to kind of do it over, right? I don't know. I think the development pattern we took on over the past, I'd say maybe 100 years even, would probably preclude us from having really, truly effective public transportation. Could we utilize it more? Yes. It's always going to be part of the solution. It's not going to be the solution. And I think that some people want to force it to be the only solution, but it's always going to have to be in conjunction with cars, I think. I just don't see, I think we're way too far past things to get past that other than automating our road networks and using those to be able to do that. But then how do you scale that? It's a whole thing, right? So bottom line is that people have to go so many places in so many different directions because we're so spread out that it probably isn't going to be effective here. But in the cities that it is effective in, it's pretty impressive and it's pretty easy to use. So just those are my observations from being on the road the last 10 days. But it's good to be back. Took me a while to get caught up in everything. I tried to kind of stay up on things as I was gone. I always try to do that when I'm out of town because, as a city manager, life doesn't stop, especially in our case. We're such a small city. People are already so busy as it is. The last thing I want to do is throw anything that I have to do on them. So a lot of things kind of get on hold, and so I have to get caught up in everything. So almost back to normal, not quite 100%, but we're getting there. This past Wednesday, speaking of things happening in Calamasa, we had our library groundbreaking. And the library actually, is being spearheaded by the Riverside County. So we're a partner in this, but the project is being managed by Riverside County. So I think it's important to distinguish that. But the city is contributing funds and is contributing to managing the project. as a party to it, but not necessarily the lead. So Riverside County did a great job with the groundbreaking. We had some pictures on our social media, so check those out. So that was this past Wednesday. It was great to be a part of that. Our library will more than double in size, and there are people that ask, why are we wasting money on a library? The reason that we're doing this is because the library we had was busting at the seams. It wasn't big enough. We're running out of capacity frequently for all the programs that are there, and they're not just for kids. We have a quilting, we have different clubs for older people as well that are very, very heavily utilized and are being utilized currently at our temporary location, which is on Calamasa Boulevard at the old Bank of America location. And so having the additional space for additional reference material, books, but also for all those different types of classes that we have that are very, very popular at our library. I don't think people realize the breadth of services. I think when they think of libraries, they think of books and they think of encyclopedias, and that's it. Libraries are so much more than that. And if you have those doubts, I encourage you to go just check it out. Just go down there and check out the list of programming that they have. Just get the calendar for the month. It's full. It's full of all sorts of things. So I encourage you to check that out. Also this week, the city of Calamasa was recognized by the Institute of Local Government for our overlay zone, believe it or not. I know that the residential overlay zone was a very controversial project, and they recognize this not only for the creativity to increase availability for housing production in order to meet our regional housing needs assessment, but the other thing that they recognized was the leadership that the city council took in accounting for community concerns. I think a lot of people understood that the need is there and that we're required to do these things. It's not like we want to do these things necessarily. And if it was up to us, we probably wouldn't have done it on our own, I should say. But it certainly is a part of the state mandate that we have to meet. And so I think that people recognize that, but they go, okay, we recognize we have to do this, but how can we do it in a way that minimizes the impacts as much as possible? It's not going to completely eliminate them, but we want to minimize them. And so the council heard that. They made modifications to the plan and got it approved, and we were still able to meet our RENA numbers. So that was one of the things that they recognized was the community input and the council's consideration and action associated with that. And so that was something that was neat to see. People came in angry to the public hearing, and a lot of people ended up thanking the council at the end of the day for their leadership and the changes that they made. So we were recognized for that, and I think that was a good recognition. So coming up, now we've talked about things that happened this week. Coming up, the city council will be having its regular council meeting on Monday, August 5th at 6 p.m. at the Norton Young Love Senior Center, located at 908 Park Avenue here in Calamasa. We have our usual consent calendar items, but we also will have our reports from our police chief and our fire chief for July activity. And we're going to have two business items. The first of which is a continued public hearing for unpaid weed abatement assessments for those to be approved to go on the tax rolls. And this is a typical thing that we do every year for people that don't do their weed abatement. We go out and do it for them. And then they have to pay us for it. And if they don't pay us for it, we put it on the tax rolls. So that's pretty much how that works. So if you've done your own weed abatement, or if you did have the city do the weed abatement and you paid us, you're not going to be affected by this. And then the second item is a discussion about city council compensation. This is an item we brought to the council's attention back in February, and a council member asked us to bring it back, so we're going to bring that back for discussion. No approvals will be done at this meeting. It'll just be a discussion on the direction that the city council wants to go in on that. So you can attend that in person, of course, as you can for all of our public meetings, or you can watch on the city's YouTube channel at cityofcalamasa.net/YouTube. And lastly, it's kind of short notice, but tonight the city of Calamasa will be participating in the Pass Area National Night Out, and that will be taking place at Noble Creek Park in Beaumont. So if you're listening to this podcast on the day it was released, which is Friday, August 2nd, you can come check us out between 5:30 p.m. and 8:30 p.m. We're going to have a booth there along with our fire department. We'll also have a booth. So come check us out there. And then next week, we will have a movie under the stars. We're partnering with the Beaumont Cherry Valley Recreation and Park District. And the event is sponsored by 5th District Supervisor, Riverside County Supervisor Ixchel Gutierrez. So we thank him for his support on this event. The movie we'll be showing is Cars, Disney Pixar Cars. We will have concessions there, as well as a kids zone. And the event starts at 7 p.m. That'll be Friday, August 9th. It's next week, Friday, August 9th at 7 p.m. at Summerwind Park, located at 1000 Engelman Drive, right here in Calamasa. And the movie will actually start at sunset. So we hope that you and your family will be able to come check that out. I'm very partial to the movie Cars. My sons really love it. They're actually going to come out with me as well. So we'll all be there to check that movie out. So we talked a lot about housing in the reality special when we talked about land use and some of the realities that we operate in. And I know that we kind of beat that subject pretty good, but I do want to share a story that came out just this week that will undoubtedly end up in court, I think. So when we've looked the last 5 years with all of the different housing laws and mandates that the state has come out with, getting more aggressive on housing production, in this state versus local control over these housing decisions and making things discretionary versus ministerial, the lawsuits and the controversies have largely centered around city council decisions, right? And those are pretty straightforward in terms of what councils can and cannot do. But one thing that I didn't touch on when we're talking about land use components during the special was the use of the referendum process to overturn development projects. There have been 208 successful local initiatives that restricted housing construction between 1973 and 2023 throughout the state of California. But the wave on that is changing a little bit. On the other hand, since 2022, voters in the cities of Menlo Park, Laguna Beach, Santa Cruz, Costa Mesa, and Nevada City have rejected anti-development measures or passed initiatives to roll back prior ones. And one example that I have that isn't necessarily involving a city council, but voters. The city of Encinitas has a law on its books that requires voter approval for any major changes to housing or land use policy. And then voters twice rejected the city's state-mandated housing plan. So we've talked about how the housing element of the general plan has to be updated every 8 years to reflect RHNA numbers, changes in state policies, things like that. And those have to be certified by the Department of Housing and Community Development, by the State Department of Housing and Community Development, HCD. Now, right now, today, states can go, okay, that, if HCD rejects your housing plan, cities can go, okay, that's great. We're going to go ahead and recertify anyway or approve it anyway, because we feel that we meet it because X, Y, and Z. We don't agree with HCD's assessment. And a court can then decide whether HCD's decision is valid or not. Well, there are laws that are going to be trying to change that. But in this case of Encinitas, the voters are required to see any major changes in housing or land use policy. So when the city council passes the latest housing element, that then goes to the voters for approval. Well, in 2016 and 2018, during the last RHNA cycle, they rejected it twice, right? A judge then ordered the plan to go forward anyway over the voters' objections. So the city said, okay, well, if the housing element is going to be passed because it's state mandated, regardless of whether the voters reject it or not. Why do we even need to spend the money to go to the voters, right? So they go to a judge and say, can we just approve it and not go to the voters going forward? And the judge said no. So that obviously puts them in a really weird situation, because now they're going to have to do the same thing, and they could have the same quandary, and it could go to a court, and the court could say the same thing again. So apparently the second judge thought that the approval was a one-off, not understand. And this is where, you get in front of a judge. A judge isn't necessarily a specialist in that area of the law, right? So part of when you go to a court is sometimes you have to educate the judge on this particular area of law. if it's not something that's, tested frequently. And so they're essentially back in the same situation with if their latest housing plan is rejected by voters again. So what they do there, I don't know. So now the city of Eureka, so we see that one, right? So a housing plan is approved by a city council, is rejected by voters, and court goes, doesn't matter because the state mandates this. So basically the state law trumps the voters' will in just rejecting it outright. But the city of Eureka is now going to take center stage as to how a referendum process goes against these new state housing mandates, or at least making it more difficult. Okay. So part of Eureka's plan to meet their housing quota, and Eureka is up in the northwest corner of California, Humboldt County. One of the ways they're going to meet their housing quota is to convert a dozen city parking lots into affordable housing. And the voters in Eureka have qualified an initiative for the November 2024 ballot to drastically increase the parking requirements for the project. So in this case, they aren't rejecting the plan outright like they did in Encinitas. What they're doing, though, is making it basically financially impossible to build. By adding these parking requirements, it's going to shrink down the number of units, and it may not meet their mandate, or it may just price the project out of being feasible. So if this were to pass, there's no doubt in my mind that if then that's included in their housing element, that the HCD will reject their plan, because they'll see the parking requirements as too big of a barrier to effectively develop the parking lot in the housing, because HCD has been getting more and more critical with every housing cycle. And this one, they've been very, very critical. And they don't look at just your plan and go, okay, yep, sounds good. They go, well, okay, but is this realistic? Is this actually going to happen? Because there were cities that were taking flood control areas that were using for flood control and placing their planned affordable housing in those areas. Well, obviously, it's never going to get built there, right? And prior to this cycle, they might have said, okay, because they didn't have much power. Well, now they're more empowered by the governor, by the attorney general to say, no, that's BS. That's not going to happen. That you're just putting something out there just to put a plan together. That's not realistic at all. So HCD is taking a lot more critical eye to what you're actually proposing. So this is where we are kind of in uncharted water. So we saw in the Encinitas case, when voters make it impossible to meet the state mandates, the state wins out, right? And there's been other cases like that as well. But we don't know what will happen when voters simply make it more difficult or complicated, but not necessarily impossible to meet the mandates, okay? And there have been other cases, in this as well. So here are a couple examples. The city of Alameda up north was caught between a state requirement to permit more housing and a local ballot initiative reaffirmed by voters in 2020 that effectively banned the construction of any apartment buildings on an island within the city. And they simply decided to ignore the will of the electorate. The city of Alameda did. City of Sausalito, also in the Bay Area, may have to reconsider a voter-enacted waterside development ordinance if it wants to permit construction in some of the places it told the state that it would. And in Yorba Linda, down here in Southern California, voters rejected a measure to rezone many of the parcels identified by the city as suitable for development in its housing plan. And now city officials are trying again while working towards and praying a more amenable outcome. So the city's in the process of revising their housing element proposal to voters coming up in November. This revised proposal was developed with the help of a resident working group that included residents from across Yorba Linda to come together to create a plan that their neighbors could all get behind and support. Now, housing advocates are going, BS, you're giving too much deference to local voters. So again, now it's one thing if we're pitting the state versus, legislator versus legislator, right? City council members versus state legislators, governor, things like that, right? I think that it's pretty clear cut that the state's probably going to win out unless they're going against the state or federal constitution. But when it's voters, I think it takes on a different tone, right? I think voters ultimately, I think that the classic wisdom has always been voters should have a bigger say, right? They should have, if they want to overrule their legislators, they should have the right to do so. And some of these cases have proved that that's not the case. So, at some point, what's the outcome of that? What's the pressure? In Newport Beach is also, facing something similar. Residents of Newport Beach asked for their housing plan to be put a vote. Now, there's not a requirement for that. They don't have a requirement to do that, but they asked the city council to do it. And the city council said, no, we're not doing it because they know they'll lose. And they look at the precedent. They look at what has happened. They're going to get sued and they're going to lose. So now you're going to end up in the same place you're going to end up in anyway, but with millions of dollars less because you had to fight lawsuits, right? Because I think if they did put it to the voters rejected it, the city gets sued. It's not like the city's just going to roll over. Why would they have done that if they knew they were going to get sued and they go anyway? You're planning for a fight at that point, I would believe. So by rejecting it now, yes, that's a bad look that you're ignoring or you're not getting the input of your voters. But if we already know that a voter initiative that probably would likely pass to reject this plan, how would you then meet the mandates that you have to meet? And the courts have said you have to meet these mandates. It's already there. The precedent is already there. You can't just keep going to the courts over and over because you're just building more and more case law that's going to help reject whatever plan you've got and whatever the voters said. So the only way to stop that, I think, is going to be an initiative that actually makes a change to the state constitution, because the legislators and the governor cannot overrule the California Constitution. So that's where it's not defined. There is nothing in the Constitution that allows voters to stop these type of things. So that might be the next battleground, right? We've seen constitutional amendments over time. Prop 13 is prominent among them. Prop 218, Prop 26. They've usually dealt with taxation. Now you may start to see constitutional amendments that deal with land use and local decisions regarding land use. So it'll be interesting to see how that all plays out. So, again, these things aren't necessarily, affecting Calamasa today, right? But I bring these up because they could affect us. And I think that if we understand and our residents understand what's happening in the state, because these things will have an impact on us, right? If we try to do the same thing, we're going to have the same result. But if our residents know, or at least enough know, that because we've talked about these things, we've talked about these things openly and honestly, that maybe it avoids those fights later, and then we can try to come up with better creative solutions that might be able to work within those parameters, rather than waste our time going through this futile effort of rejecting something and just say, screw you, state, we're not going to listen to you because we don't want to. Because here's the thing, if we ignore the state has been aggressively pursuing these cities, and that's what's changed. That is really what has changed over the last 5 years. You have these laws, and then you have a governor and an AG that are willing to fight for those laws that they've passed. And there are even more aggressive laws that are coming out that are still making their way through the legislature. So here's one example. There's a bill making its way through from Senator Wiener up in San Francisco. He's been a big pusher of a lot of these big controversial laws for housing that would impose a $50,000 fine per month on cities that do not have a certified housing element by the state-imposed deadline. The state-imposed deadline for a housing element was 2 years, was over 2 years ago. over 2 years ago. The city of Calamesa's housing element is going to council for approval on August 19th. So right now, we do not have one. If this bill were in effect, we would be getting fined $50,000 per month. Now, there's already a law in the books that says you get fined $10,000 per month, but there is an allowance for cities making a good faith effort to get their housing plan approved, which we've been doing. We've been doing that this entire time, and we've been engaged with HCD. We've had about a half a dozen rounds of comments back and forth, and it's been really frustrating because every time they add new stuff. We resolve one thing and then they find something else. And that's been part of the problem and part of the frustration with HCD is that there's been a lot of inconsistency in what they're doing. And they go, well, what about this? Well, what about this? Well, what about this? When those things were already in the element 2 or 3 revisions ago. And now they're bringing them up, so that was what's frustrating about it. But now with this new law, if it were to go into effect, you also it gets rid of that good faith grace period. So if you don't have your housing element certified by HCD, even if you're making a good faith effort to get it approved, you would still be subject to the fine. That is scary stuff. That is really scary stuff because you figure $50,000 in fines per month for 12 months. That's $600,000. That's 6% of our budget. That is 6% of our general fund budget. Imagine what our city could do with $600,000 that we'd be just sending to the state. And Cal Cities, to their credit, has come out strongly opposed to this on behalf of cities because they see it too. Everyone sees how this is. This is one issue, I will say, that has united cities of all political affiliations. It is amazing how cities of different political philosophies have come together to reject these things and saying, state, you're going way too far with these things. And it's been interesting to watch. It's rare where the city of Calamasa and the city of LA or the city of Santa Monica, let's say, or something like, a liberal progressive city is in lockstep with us in terms of something, right? But we are in lockstep with that kind of thing. We're all saying, state, you guys got it wrong. You guys have had this wrong. So again, I bring these things up because I think it's important for our residents to understand what is happening at the state level because it could and will affect us one day. And we want to make sure that our citizens are ahead of it, that we're ahead of the curve. We're watching these things now so that if it does impact us one day, we already know kind of what to expect. We already know what we need to do. And our residents are also informed about what we need to do. And that's the point of this podcast. So I hope that you see that. I hope you've enjoyed it. And with that, we're going to wrap up this week's episode. Please make sure you tell your friends about the podcast and encourage them to subscribe on their favorite podcast app so they'll never miss an episode. I know you've done it already if you're listening. But if you haven't, make sure you do so. We're on about a dozen different platforms, so hopefully you'll check that out. So again, reminder, our city council meeting is this Monday, August 5th at 6 p.m., so we hope to see you there, or at least see you online. And until then, have a great weekend. It's supposed to be a hot one, so try to stay cool, and I'll talk to you again next week. Thanks for joining us.